The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Mrs. Chen drove home from her regular volunteer shift at the local Veterans Center. The setting sun painted the suburban Atlanta sky in beautiful shades of orange and purple, making it a perfect evening for a peaceful drive. She hummed along to her favorite oldie station, thinking about the heartwarming stories the veterans had shared with her that day. At 52, Mrs. Chen had dedicated the past 15 years to supporting military families, inspired by her husband, a retired Marine captain with an impressive 25-year service record. Their shared commitment to the community had made them beloved figures in the neighborhood. The proud military family and Veterans for Peace stickers on her modest blue sedan told just a small part of their story. The familiar streets of her neighborhood seemed different that evening as red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. Mrs. Chen carefully pulled over, just as her husband had taught her. She turned down the radio, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and took deep breaths to stay calm. Through her mirror, she could see two officers approaching her car, their hands unusually close to their weapons. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself. "Everything will be fine." But something felt off about this stop. The taller officer's aggressive stance and his partner's stern expression sent a chill down her spine, despite the warm evening air. "License and registration," the taller officer demanded, his voice harsh and cold. His nameplate read Officer Thompson. Mrs. Chen noticed he hadn't mentioned why she'd been pulled over, a detail her husband always said was standard procedure. "Of course, officer," she replied politely, reaching slowly for her documents. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Her military spouse ID fell out along with her license, catching Officer Thompson's eye. The second officer circled her car, flashlight beam dancing across her back seat where donation boxes for the Veterans Center sat neatly packed. "We got reports of suspicious activity in the area," Thompson said, his tone shifting as he examined her military ID. "A vehicle matching your description was reportedly involved in some illegal activities." Mrs. Chen's heart raced. In 15 years of driving through this neighborhood, she'd never been stopped, let alone accused of anything suspicious. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice steady despite her growing unease. "I'm just heading home from the Veterans Center where I volunteer. You can call them to verify." "Step out of the vehicle," Thompson cut her off, his hand now resting on his weapon. The second officer had moved closer, blocking her view of the growing number of onlookers gathering on the sidewalk. Mrs. Chen could see her neighbors watching from their porches, some with phones raised. Mr. Rodriguez from across the street had stopped watering his flowers, garden hose still running. Mrs. Patel from next door stood frozen at her mailbox, concern etched on her face. "Officer, please." Mrs. Chen tried again, her hands trembling slightly but still visible on the steering wheel. "My husband is a retired Marine captain. We've lived in this neighborhood for—" I said, "Step out of the vehicle." Thompson's voice boomed through the quiet street, drawing more attention from nearby homes. A young couple walking their dog had stopped to witness the scene, the woman already dialing on her phone. As Mrs. Chen carefully reached for her seatbelt, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the rearview mirror. The face looking back at her was that of a respected community member, a devoted military spouse, and a woman who had spent countless hours serving others. Yet somehow, on this beautiful autumn evening, none of that seemed to matter to these officers. Little did she know, this routine drive home was about to spark a chain of events that would shake their peaceful community to its core and force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, respect, and the true meaning of service to one's community. The tension in the air grew thicker as Officer Thompson towered over Mrs. Chen's car door. His partner, Officer Reed, had positioned himself near the trunk, creating an intimidating presence that made her feel trapped. The donation boxes in her backseat rustled as a cool breeze swept through her open window, carrying with it the distant sound of children being hurried indoors by concerned parents. "Ma'am," We've received reports of someone matching your description involved in suspicious activities, Thompson repeated, his voice dripping with unwarranted suspicion. Mrs. Chen's military spouse ID lay on the dashboard where he tossed it, seemingly dismissing its significance. Officer, there must be some misunderstanding, Mrs. Chen said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. I've just finished my volunteer shift at the Veterans Center. I can show you my volunteer badge. We're not interested in your badges, Thompson interrupted, his tone growing harsher. We've got reports of drug-related activities in this area, and your vehicle matches the description we received. Mrs. Chen felt her stomach drop. Through her side mirror, she could see Mr. Rodriguez had turned off his garden hose and was now recording with his phone. Mrs. Patel had disappeared from her mailbox, but moments later, she emerged from her house with her husband, both wearing concerned expressions. Drug activities. Mrs. Chen's voice wavered slightly. Officer, I've lived in this neighborhood for over 15 years. I volunteer at the Veterans Center every Tuesday and Thursday. You can call the center director right now. Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. Officer Reed suddenly commanded from behind, making her jump. Keep your hands where we can see them. Mrs. Chen's hands shook as she carefully unbuckled her seatbelt. Her mind raced to her husband's words from years ago. Stay calm, comply with their commands, but remember your rights. The evening air felt unusually cold as she stepped out of her car, her legs unsteady beneath her. More neighbors had gathered now, maintaining a cautious distance but watching intently. The young couple with the dog had moved closer, their phones raised high. Their German shepherd whined anxiously, picking up on the growing tension. Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle, Thompson ordered, his hands still resting on his weapon. As Mrs. Chen complied, she could hear whispers from the growing crowd. Someone mentioned calling the local news station. Officer, she tried one more time, her voice clear but trembling. I'd like to call my husband. He's a retired Marine captain. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the now silent street as Officer Thompson roughly secured them around Mrs. Chen's wrists. The cool metal bit into her skin, a shocking contrast to the warm evening air. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of how a routine drive home had turned into this nightmare. Please, the handcuffs are too tight. She winced, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Through her tears, she could see Officer Bryant shifting uncomfortably, his rookie status evident in his hesitation to intervene. The crowd of neighbors had grown larger, their phones recording every moment. Mrs. Patel's voice carried across the lawn as she spoke urgently into her phone. Yes, right in front of our houses. They're arresting her for no reason. Please hurry. Officer Reed emerged from Mrs. Chen's car, holding one of the donation boxes. Found some unlabeled pills in here, he announced triumphantly. Mrs. Chen's heart sank. She immediately knew what he'd found. Those are vitamin donations for homeless veterans, she protested, her voice stronger now despite her fear. Each bottle is sealed and labeled. They're part of our monthly care package program. Please, just read the donation inventory. You can explain it all down at the station. Thompson cut her off, starting to guide her toward the patrol car. The growing crowd of neighbors stirred, their murmurs of dissent growing louder. Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward, his phone still recording. Officers, this is wrong. We all know Mrs. Chen. She runs the veteran support programs. Those are donations. We all contributed to them. The young couple with the dog had been live-streaming the entire incident. Their German shepherd barked anxiously as Officer Thompson roughly guided Mrs. Chen toward the patrol car. Over 10,000 people are watching this live right now, the young woman called out, her voice shaking but determined. As they reached the patrol car, Mrs. Chen caught her reflection in the window. Her usually neat hair had come undone, and tears had left trails on her cheeks. But what struck her most was the sight of her volunteer badge, still hanging around her neck. a bitter irony that spoke volumes about the injustice unfolding. "My husband." She tried one last time, turning to Officer Bryant, who seemed the most likely to listen. "Please just let me call my husband. He's a retired Marine captain." "Get in the car," Thompson ordered, pushing her head down as he guided her into the backseat. The door slammed shut with a finality that made her flinch. Through the window, she could see the scene continuing to unfold. Officer Reed was still ransacking her car, throwing aside carefully packed care packages. The vitamins and sealed personal care items that local pharmacies had donated now lay scattered across the street. Mrs. Patel rushed forward with her phone. "Your husband's on his way," she called out before Officer Reed stepped in front of her, blocking her view of the patrol car. Inside the car, Mrs. Chen tried to steady her breathing. The handcuffs dug into her back uncomfortably as she heard Thompson and Reed discussing charges outside. Officer Bryant's voice occasionally rose in what sounded like protest, but was quickly shut down by his superior officers. The patrol car's radio crackled to life. "Be advised, we're receiving multiple calls about this situation. Local news crew en route to your location." Thompson's response was immediate. "Let's move out. Now." He slid into the driver's seat, ignoring the growing chorus of protests from the neighbors. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Mrs. Chen caught one last glimpse of her community through tear-blurred eyes. Mr. Rodriguez was comforting his teenage son, who looked both angry and scared. The young couple continued filming, their dog barking at the departing police car. Mrs. Patel stood in her driveway, phone still pressed to her ear, while her husband gathered the scattered donations from the street. The familiar streets of her neighborhood blurred past the window as they drove away. The same streets she'd driven countless times while delivering care packages to veteran families now felt foreign and hostile. But even through her fear and confusion, Mrs. Chen felt a glimmer of hope. She'd seen the phones recording, heard the voices raised in protest, and knew that somewhere behind them, her husband was already on his way. What these officers didn't realize was that their actions tonight wouldn't just disappear into a police report. They had unknowingly sparked something much bigger. A community's unified stand against injustice, captured frame by frame on dozens of phones, spreading across social media with every passing minute. Within an hour of Mrs. Chen's arrest, the police station's parking lot filled with veterans. They came in their service caps and medals, some walking with canes, others in wheelchairs, but all united in purpose. Captain Chen, still wearing his garden gloves from yard work, stood at the front of the group, his military bearing evident in his straight spine and steady gaze. Inside the station, desk officers watched nervously as their parking lot transformed into an impromptu gathering of military veterans. The young couple's live stream had exploded across social media, reaching local veterans groups and military families across the state. Their German shepherd, now wearing a service dog vest, sat alertly beside them as they continued documenting events. "That's her car," a retired Army surgeon said, pointing to Mrs. Chen's sit-in being towed into the policed impound. "The one with all the donations scattered across the backseat. I helped pack those boxes yesterday at the center." The station's phone lines were ringing nonstop. Mr. Rodriguez's video had gone viral, showing Officers Thompson and Reed's aggressive behavior in crystal clear detail. The department's social media pages flooded with comments from angry citizens and military families sharing their own stories of encounters with these officers. Mrs. Patel arrived with her laptop, setting up at a nearby coffee shop that had become an impromptu command center. Her screen showed dozens of open tabs, news outlets requesting information, veterans advocacy groups offering support, and civil rights organizations reaching out to help. "Look at this," she called out, turning her screen. A video compilation was trending, showing Officer Thompson's previous encounters with minority residents. Each clip revealed a pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. Captain Chen stood resolute at the station's front desk, his voice carrying the weight of his 25 years of service. My wife has dedicated her life to helping veterans. Those suspicious pills you claim to find. Sealed vitamin bottles donated by local pharmacies for homeless veterans. Everything documented. Everything above board. The desk sergeant squirmed uncomfortably. Sir, we're following proper procedure. Proper procedure. A retired Navy commander stepped forward, leaning on his cane. I've watched your officers violate at least 6 departmental procedures in that video. Would you like me to list them? My daughter teaches police accountability law at the state university. Outside, more community members arrived. The local news van pulled up, their cameras capturing the growing crowd. Mr. Rodriguez's teenage son had created a hashtag that was now trending nationally. Hashtag Justice for Mercian. His social media updates provided a steady stream of information to thousands of followers. The young couple's livestream captured the arrival of a distinguished-looking woman in a sharp suit, a prominent civil rights attorney who'd seen their video and driven straight from her office. Captain Chen, she called out, making her way through the crowd. I'd like to offer my services pro bono. Inside the station, Mrs. Chen sat in a holding cell, still wearing her volunteer badge. She could hear the commotion outside growing louder. Officer Bryant, the rookie who'd shown hesitation during her arrest, walked past her cell for the 3rd time, looking increasingly troubled. Ma'am, he finally said, voice low. The chief is on his way in. There's a lot of people out there for you. A small smile crossed Mrs. Chen's face despite her tears. She could hear familiar voices now, the veterans she'd helped over the years, her neighbors, her community. Even through the walls, she could feel their presence, their unity, their determination. The police chief's car pulled into the back entrance, where he was immediately met by local news cameras. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the first video went viral. Now, faced with a parking lot full of decorated veterans, trending social media hashtags, and mounting evidence of his officers' misconduct, he knew this situation had become much bigger than a simple wrongful arrest. Sir, his assistant called out, hurrying over with a tablet. The governor's office is on the line. They've seen the videos, and the Military Veterans Caucus is demanding immediate action. The chief looked out at the gathering crowd, noting the mix of military uniforms, news cameras, and determined community members. In his 20 years of law enforcement, he'd never seen such a unified response. As Captain Chen's steady gaze met his through the station windows, he realized this night would mark a turning point, not just for Mrs. Chen, but for the entire department. The police chief's office buzzed with tension as he reviewed the body camera footage for the 3rd time. Each viewing revealed more troubling details of Mrs. Chen's arrest. On his desk, his phone wouldn't stop lighting up with messages from city council members, veteran organizations, and the mayor's office. Play that segment again, he instructed the internal affairs investigator, pointing to the screen. The footage clearly showed Officer Thompson ignoring Mrs. Chen's military spoused ID and dismissing her explanation of the veteran donations. More disturbing were the comments picked up by the body camera's microphone. Comments that made the chief's stomach turn. Down the hall, Officer Bryant sat in the interview room, his rookie status making him the first to break ranks. I tried to speak up, he explained to the investigators, his hands fidgeting with his notepad. The vitamin bottles were clearly labeled as donations. There was a whole inventory list taped to each box. Meanwhile, in the station's lobby, the crowd had grown even larger. Local news crews interviewed veterans who'd benefited from Mrs. Chen's programs. A retired Air Force colonel spoke passionately about how her care packages had helped his homeless veteran support group. She remembered every veteran's dietary restrictions, the colonel explained to the cameras, his voice thick with emotion. She kept detailed records of who needed sugar-free candies, who was allergic to peanuts. That's the kind of person they're accusing of drug possession. The young couple's livestream had now reached over 1 million views. Their German Shepherd had become an internet sensation, viewers commenting on how the dog had sensed the injustice of the situation. Social media experts were calling it a masterclass in civilian journalism. Back in the chief's office, the internal affairs team presented their preliminary findings. Officer Thompson's record revealed a disturbing pattern. Multiple complaints of bias, excessive force, and false arrests, all mysteriously marked as resolved by his former supervisor. "Sir," his assistant interrupted, tablet in hand, "the State Police Oversight Committee is on line 1. And there's something else you need to see." She pulled up a new video compilation. Dozens of residents sharing similar stories about Officers Thompson and Reed, each clip more damaging than the last. In the holding area, Mrs. Chen had finally been moved to a proper interview room, where she sat with her husband and their civil rights attorney. The attorney's team had assembled a mountain of evidence: donation records, volunteer schedules, and character statements from hundreds of veterans. "Your officers didn't just arrest my client," the attorney explained firmly to the investigation team. "They arrested a pillar of the veteran community. Every bottle they claimed was suspicious is documented in these records, every donation tracked and accounted for." Officer Reed paced nervously in another interview room, his confidence crumbling as he watched public opinion turn against them. The hashtag Justice for Mershin had reached the national news, with politicians and celebrities sharing the story. Mr. Rodriguez's original video had been picked up by major news networks, his teenage son now being praised for his quick thinking in documenting the incident. Mrs. Patel's impromptu command center at the coffee shop had evolved into a full-scale operation, coordinating media responses and community support. The police chief stood at his office window, watching more community members arrive with signs and supplies for the peaceful protest. Among them, he spotted familiar faces, people he'd served with, neighbors he'd greeted at community meetings, veterans who'd trusted the department to protect them. "Sir," his assistant called again, "Internal Affairs just finished analyzing Officer Thompson's body camera archive. You need to see this immediately." The footage on the screen left no room for doubt. Years of misconduct, caught on camera, saved in files that should have been reviewed long ago. The chief's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his phone. This wasn't just about one wrongful arrest anymore. This was about systemic failures that could no longer be ignored. In the interview room, Mrs. Chen shared a knowing look with her husband as they heard increasing activity in the hallway. Through the window, they could see high-ranking officers hurrying past, files in hand. The truth was finally coming to light, carried forward by the united voice of a community that refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. The courthouse steps were packed with supporters as Mrs. Chen walked in with her husband and legal team. Her volunteer badge, now a symbol of resilience, caught the morning sunlight. The young couple who'd captured the original livestream stood nearby, their German shepherd wearing a new vest that read "Support Mrs. Chen." Inside the courtroom, the evidence mounted like an unstoppable wave. The civil rights attorney's presentation was methodical and devastating. On the screen, body camera footage played, showing years of similar incidents involving Officers Thompson and Reed. "Your Honor," the attorney began, her voice clear and confident, "what happened to Mrs. Chen wasn't an isolated incident. It was the inevitable result of a system that ignored red flags and dismissed complaints." In the gallery, veterans filled the seats, many wearing their service caps. The retired Air Force colonel who'd spoken to the news had organized a rotation so that every hearing would have a full attendance. They sat straight-backed and attentive, their presence a silent reminder of the community Mrs. Chen had served. Mr. Rodriguez's video played next, showing the unlawful search of the donation boxes. The police department's lawyer shifted uncomfortably as the footage clearly showed Officer Thompson ignoring Mrs. Chen's explanation about the vitamin donations. Each bottle, the attorney continued, holding up evidence bags, was sealed and documented. "We have receipts from 3 local pharmacies confirming their donations to the Veterans Program." We have photographs of Mrs. Chen organizing these same care packages at the Veterans Center just hours before her arrest. Mrs. Patel testified about years of witnessing Mrs. Chen's dedication to the veteran community. Her laptop contained spreadsheets tracking every donation, every delivery, every thank you note from grateful veterans. The judge leaned forward, particularly interested in the detailed records. Officer Bryant's testimony proved crucial. As the youngest officer involved, his honest account of that evening carried special weight. "I knew something was wrong," he admitted, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. The donation boxes were clearly labeled. Mrs. Chen's military spouse ID was right there. But when I tried to speak up, the police chief's internal investigation had uncovered more than anyone expected. Dozens of complaints against Thompson and Reed had been buried or dismissed. Body camera footage had been misfiled. Witness statements had disappeared from records. During a break in proceedings, Captain Chen stood in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by fellow veterans. His military bearing remained strong, but those who knew him could see the emotional toll of the past weeks in his eyes. "What they did to my wife," he said to a reporter, "they'd done to others. But this time, they picked someone with a whole community behind her. Someone whose life's work has been helping others. And we won't let that go unanswered." The young couple's live stream had evolved into a documentary project capturing every day of the proceedings. Their footage showed the human side of the story. Mrs. Chen continuing her volunteer work despite the stress, veterans organizing support rallies, community members stepping up to keep the donation programs running. Back in the courtroom, the evidence kept coming. Officer Thompson's own body camera had captured inappropriate comments made during other stops. Officer Reed's text messages revealed concerning attitudes about minority residents. The department's training records showed gaps in bias awareness and community relations education. "Your Honor," the civil rights attorney concluded, "this case isn't just about one wrongful arrest. It's about trust broken, power abused, and a community calling for change." The judge's chambers filled with boxes of evidence, donation records, volunteer schedules, character statements, body camera footage, internal affairs reports. But perhaps most compelling were the countless letters from veterans describing how Mrs. Chen's programs had helped them through difficult times. Outside, the courthouse steps had become a gathering place for supporters. Mr. Rodriguez's teenage son had organized a social media campaign that reached across the country, connecting similar cases and building a network of advocacy groups. Mrs. Patel's coffee shop command center had evolved into a formal organization dedicated to police accountability and community relations. As the sun set on another day of proceedings, Mrs. Chen stood at the courthouse window, watching the crowd below. Her arrest had started as a nightmare, but it had awakened something powerful: a community's determination to stand together, to fight for justice, and to protect those who dedicated their lives to helping others. The morning sun streamed through the police department's newly renovated community room as Mrs. Chen cut the ribbon at the grand opening. 6 months had passed since her wrongful arrest, and the changes in the department were remarkable. The room, once a stark meeting space, now served as a bridge between law enforcement and the community they served. "This isn't just a victory for me," Mrs. Chen addressed the crowd, her voice strong and clear. "This is a victory for everyone who's ever felt voiceless, for every community that's wanted to be heard." Behind her, a wall displayed photographs of community events, including veterans programs and police community partnerships. The settlement had been substantial, but more important were the reforms it brought. Officer Thompson and Reed had been terminated, their records now part of a state database tracking police misconduct. The young rookie, Officer Bryant, stood proudly in his new role as community liaison officer, his commitment to positive change earning him respect from both the department and residents. In the audience, Mr. Rodriguez sat with his teenage son, who'd become something of a local hero. Their video documentation had sparked a movement, leading to the creation of a civilian oversight committee. The teenager now ran workshops teaching others how to safely and effectively document police interactions. Mrs. Patel's impromptu command center had evolved into a permanent community organization. The coffee shop where she'd first set up her laptop now hosted monthly meetings between police officers and community members, fostering understanding and trust over cups of coffee and honest conversation. The young couple's livestream had turned into an award-winning documentary, capturing not just the injustice of that night, but the powerful way a community had united to demand change. Their German Shepherd, now a certified therapy dog, visited the station regularly, helping break down barriers between officers and visitors. Captain Chen stood at his wife's side as she announced the launch of their new foundation. The Bridge Foundation, she explained, will support both police reform and veteran services. Because real change happens when communities work together. The foundation would provide legal aid to those facing similar situations while also maintaining the veteran support programs that had been Mrs. Chen's life's work. The police chief, who'd taken the brave step of acknowledging his department's failures, now led workshops for other departments across the state. What happened to Mrs. Chen opened our eyes, he shared. It showed us that good policing isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about understanding and serving our community. The retired Air Force colonel who'd rallied veterans to Mrs. Chen's cause now headed the Civilian Oversight Committee. Under his leadership, complaints were investigated thoroughly, body camera footage was reviewed regularly, and community input was actively sought and valued. In the station's new training room, screens displayed updated protocols and procedures. Bias awareness training had been completely revamped, with input from community members and civil rights experts. New officers learned about the Chen incident as part of their training, a powerful reminder of their duty to serve and protect all members of the community. The donation program had grown stronger than ever. The vitamin bottles that had been used to justify Mrs. Chen's arrest were now part of an expanded care package program, reaching twice as many homeless veterans as before. Local pharmacies had increased their support, inspired by how the community had rallied around the program. Outside the station, the memorial garden where Mrs. Chen had once been handcuffed had been transformed. Benches invited conversation, and plaques told stories of community police partnerships. Mr. Rodriguez's garden center had donated plants, and veterans groups helped maintain the space. As the ceremony concluded, Mrs. Chen looked out at the gathered crowd. Police officers chatting with residents, veterans sharing stories with rookie cops, young people engaging in meaningful dialogue with community leaders. The nightmare of her arrest had transformed into something powerful. A template for positive change, a story of community strength, and a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still prevail. The sun caught her volunteer badge, still proudly worn after all these months. But now it was joined by another badge, one identifying her as the chair of the Police Community Relations Board. Her wrongful arrest had started as a single incident on a quiet suburban street, but it had grown into a movement that would continue to create positive change for years to come.